Thank you to the Heritage Foundation, and I'm glad to have my wife Anita, also at Hillsdale College, here with me. And thank you, audience. And it's hard to have a stoic calm about Franklin Roosevelt because he's such a fascinating figure. It was fun to write a book in which Franklin Roosevelt is the major figure in the book. He is exciting to write on. He is a central figure in American history, and it is very questionable whether he warrants a place as a great president in American history. I see his life in many ways as a political tragedy. Here you had somebody who was living off the fame of his famous cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. It helped get him elected to the state legislature in New York and an appointment as Assistant Secretary of Navy, just as Theodore Roosevelt had held decades earlier. Minor positions, he's 40 years old, has accomplished very little on his own. And then he gets polio, a career-ending disease for just about anybody who ever had it. But Roosevelt, one trait he had was persistence. And that persistence, plus the help of some friends he had, Lewis Howe and Missy LeHand in particular, those assistants who worked and chugged on his behalf and wrote letters. And Roosevelt was there in his wheelchair, was able to shake hands, was able to, with assistance, walk with guidance and help holding him up. Roosevelt was able to turn this lackluster career into an upset victory for governor of New York, the largest state in the Union, what puts him in contention for the presidential hunt in 1932, and then lo and behold, a Great Depression, and the Republican era is going to be shattered and ended. Roosevelt will assume the presidency. And here you have somebody charismatic, somebody who had a way with words, eloquent on the radio, starts out saying the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, trying to instill confidence in the American people. All of this, a dramatic story, overcoming adversity into the presidency at a grand time in our history. And yet I submit that his career is that of a political tragedy. He had a failed presidency in the sense that he never got us out of the Great Depression. In his first two terms, he had a situation which was so bad that we had unemployment 6 years after he was president of over 20%. When you consider that before the Great Depression, the highest rate of unemployment that we had ever had in our history was 18%. To be in office for 6 years, to launch the New Deal, and then at the end of 6 years, to have 20% unemployment. Sometimes it would range down to 17 or 18, but in that range, 17 to 21, is a failure that simply must be explained. What in the world went wrong? Let me just talk about this a little bit by quoting from Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau was put in the Treasury Department because he was such a good friend of Roosevelt's. Roosevelt wanted an ally in the Treasury Department, someone who would help him implement programs, spend money. The two, Roosevelt and Morgenthau, they lived near each other in upstate New York. They had campaigned in politics together. Morgenthau knew Roosevelt before his polio episode. Their wives shopped together. The two men would chat and pass notes during cabinet meetings sometimes. Morgenthau had a sign in his office from Roosevelt, a picture of both of them, and Roosevelt signed it, "To Henry, from one of two of a kind, Franklin Roosevelt." Morgenthau deeply liked Roosevelt and gave his life in career to help Roosevelt. And yet dealing with this unemployment was so frustrating to Morgenthau that finally in 1939, Morgenthau said this. He said it privately. He did not make this a public statement, but he said it nonetheless privately to Democratic leaders. "We have tried spending money We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot. He knew whereof he was speaking. He saw the statistics on unemployment. He saw the statistics on the national debt. From 1776 and the Revolutionary War up to the time Roosevelt came into office, we accumulated about $20 billion of debt. Roosevelt, in the 7 years in which we still had 20% or thereabouts unemployment, had spent another $20 billion. In other words, in Roosevelt's 2 terms, or less than his 2 terms actually, we spent more than every administration in the United States had ever spent on federal spending, whether it's Civil War, World War I, Mexican War, Revolutionary War, whatever. The federal debt had doubled. The New Deal had created circumstances where unemployment was still at 20% or almost 20%. Morgenthau was expressing his frustration, and the question we must ask is, what went wrong? What went wrong? I think as we analyze the New Deal programs, and I study many of them in depth in my book, we can look at them and say a centrally directed economy simply does not work well at all. A centrally directed economy ultimately results in programs that fail, programs that have terrible unintended consequences, programs that do not accomplish what market forces accomplish. In the case of Roosevelt, he was so sure it would go well because he had brain trusters working with him. He had experts. Let me give you a couple examples. Programs designed by experts, heavily influenced by experts. You start out with a farming crisis. Roosevelt's program, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The problem? Well, the farmers are getting low prices because there's a lot of overproduction. Now, part of the reason we have overproduction is because under President Hoover, we passed the highest tariff in U.S. history. Other nations, when we refuse to buy their imports, they refuse to buy our imports. Thus, the agricultural market, which for example, in wheat is about 25% of the total crop, you lose your export market, you have a surplus, and you have declining prices. Well, now, it might occur to someone that getting rid of the tariff would help because then other countries would be more likely to buy your goods because you're buying more of their goods. And to Roosevelt's credit, he did talk in the campaign and eventually moved toward freer trade. To his credit, that he did do, but it was a slow process. Right off, it was the AAA, and the idea here's the solution. And the brain trusters helped him with this. We will pay farmers not to produce. And if we pay farmers not to produce on part of their land, then some of the land will be taken out of circulation. We won't have crops that would have been produced on that land that go to market. And then the remaining crop will have a higher price because there won't be as much of it. And therefore, that will help solve the farming crisis. Well, first we get into the unintended consequences. We're going to pay farmers not to produce. It sounds funny, doesn't it? We have hungry people. We have over 20% unemployment, so we'll pay people not to produce. But in any case, we've started out, and we find that some farmers say, yeah, we'll take 25% of our land out of circulation. But we have to send people around to check on them because although they say that they'll take it out of circulation, if we don't have somebody go over to make sure they actually did, then we will be paying them to plant more crops on their land. So we have to send checkers around. Well, lo and behold, the checkers are there measuring land on thousands and hundreds of thousands of farms throughout the country. And then we found out that a lot of diminishing of the land is not occurring because some of the checkers are being bribed.